One of my favorite bodybuilders, Antoine Vaillant, has recently torn his second bicep and relapsed. In this video, we're going to find out why, so that it can help other people who have addictive tendencies or have struggled with addiction to avoid the same mistakes. But before we do, please subscribe to the channel, like the video if you haven't already, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. Today we're going to be reviewing, commentating on, and responding to Antoine's latest video on his channel. This video is called He Relapsed Part 2. Actually, it's called Relapse Part 2 in Rehab. We've all been cheering Antoine on since his relapse, but recently he tore his bicep and after doing so, made 3 videos on his channel. The first video was a description on, basically a guide on how not to tear your bicep. The second video was a compelling video taken at rehab months ago of Antoine speaking to his audience, telling them that he relapsed, admitting to or confessing to his audience that he relapsed. This second video is a continuation of that video taken on a separate date while he was still at rehab. We're going to go through the video and comment on things that are interesting or maybe valuable to the audience.
All right, my friends. It is June 19th, and I've been in rehab since June 1st, because in my last video, which was filmed May 31st, I was saying, hey guys, my name is Antoine and I fucked up pretty much. And I did relapse and I couldn't stop by myself. So, and because my support in Burlington is amazing, that's why I stayed there, is that if I would, God forbid, relapse, I wouldn't be able to get away with it for too long. So all my friends were like, what's wrong with this guy? Something's happening. And eventually like it was to the point that like my friends Ensign had my location services on, because I was like, well, guys, if you want to make sure this and that, you know where I am every time, right? Yeah. That didn't stop me. I had a burner phone.
Did you?
I had a burner phone. So I had this other phone. I bought a SIM card like an idiot. I wanted to go pick up drugs and stuff like that. Yeah. They wouldn't know, right? So they think I would be sleeping at home and I'd be doing like a stupid shit.
This is really interesting. So Antoine is doing a couple of things that we should comment on. First of all, why would somebody that's going through addiction tell their friends to use their location services to watch over them and then have a burner phone on the side just in case you do actually want to use drugs to go use it? It sounds really irrational, but in an addict's mind, there can be reasons to do this. First of all, one of them is this concept of codependency. If you have people you look up to, you care about their opinion, you want to satisfy them. So even when an addict is in a state of addiction, sometimes he or she will want to please others. So that's one part of it. A second part is to be able to moderate your use. You know that, hey, if I go completely out, meaning I relapse very severely, they'll realize it. I'll leave my place, I'll be gone, I won't just be using the burner. So it's sort of a protection mechanism. I can cheat a little bit and I still have some oversight as well. Note that he's intentionally outing himself on video in a really, almost humiliating manner. And the reason addicts do this, addicts that really care about the sobriety do this, is to not leave themselves a chance to escape from. If you already know that I was this devious, I had a burner phone and so on, if you look over me again, I won't be able to trick you in the same way. He's trying to build restrictions to prevent himself from being able to break his sobriety again.
I had a slip in February, and I'll get to that in a little bit, when I had my ankle surgery. And I had another slip a year ago in May. Okay. But before that, I was good since 2016. This
is also really hard to admit in sobriety. So in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous is what AA is. And I believe that Antoine is a part of a 12-step group, whether it's AA or NA or something else, Narcotics Anonymous. In AA, it's really troubling to admit that you've relapsed. So Antoine was just describing the fact that he had been sober since 2016, but he relapsed a couple of times along the way. In AA, every time you admit that you've relapsed, you lose sort of your seniority. As you become sober for over a year, you start to develop some seniority, you start to help other people who have less sobriety than you, guiding them in their lives. And when you've relapsed, it's actually humiliating in the society. You no longer can advise others. You have to oftentimes restart your sponsorship, which we'll talk about a bit later. And so it really puts you in a difficult position to admit these things. But without admitting them, you can't be completely honest with yourself and with others. And dishonesty is sometimes plays a role in addiction. To be honest, a lot of people that have been and been sober for a few years will relapse and not tell people about it and continue, say, being sober for another year before another relapse happens. We often find this out in AA because people who have relapsed will admit, hey, I actually did relapse 5 years ago, I just never told anybody about it, and then eventually got worse.
My friends were like, pretty much like, hey, we know you should go to rehab, and I told them at some point, like I denounced myself. I was like, yeah, guys, I can't stop. I want to stop. And at first I didn't want to go to rehab because I was like, all my contracts required me to do a certain amount of posts per month. And
so what Antoine is talking about here is a serious consideration for alcoholics or addicts when they want to go get treatment. Then this happened to me before. The initial thought comes to mind is that you really want to get sober, but once you've decided to go seek counsel or treatment, you start to worry about what you're losing. Oh my, I have a job, I have to do this, I have to do that. And you start to, interestingly, this happens with most people, you start to negotiate with the treatment provider. Like, hey dude, I have this work, I have to do this, you have to let me out sometimes. But in the back of your mind, sometimes you'll also be thinking, because you're in rehabs, you're actually, it's almost like a prison of some kind. You're locked in there, you lose control of your phone, your bank accounts, and so on. So with that in mind, knowing that you won't have an opportunity to use drugs or drink or whatever, sometimes you'll try to build an opportunity for you to do so through your responsibilities. So sometimes it can be genuinely that you're worried about your responsibilities. Your psychology will start to tell you, oh, there's so many things that could go wrong if you go to treatment. The second one will be, sometimes you're trying to find an opportunity for yourself to relapse if you want.
So I was trying to find a way, like an outpatient program, and it just wouldn't cut it, right?
Let's talk about that too. What's an outpatient program? So generally, there's like 3 stages of this. There's rehabs, which are inpatient, very costly usually have medical professionals in-house. They oftentimes deal with withdrawals and the initial stages of sobriety. Then when people graduate from rehabs, they tend to go to things called sober livings. Sober livings, by definition, don't need to have treatment facilities within them, but rather are just a house where sober people live together. And there's usually some, depending on the sober living, there's usually some requirements for the people living there. An outpatient facility is a rehab facility that people often visit from sober living. So you may move to a sober living, but you still need some psychotherapy or things like that. They'll go to a rehab, but as an outpatient, meaning they're not living there. And sometimes people go to an outpatient treatment facility even when they're not at a sober living. This gives you the opportunity to go in, get some treatment, and then have freedom with the rest of your day.
Rehab is great because it's like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're kind of like cut off from the outside world. And it's not only to like keep you away from the drugs, because if you just are in a jail cell, you don't do any rehab, and you go back outside, you're going to go back out and do the same mistakes.
Actually, I wonder if that's true. I beg to differ. I think that, of course, what Antoine is saying is right, is that without the actual work on yourself or without changing your behavior, just being away from drugs and then meeting them again won't be any guarantee that you don't use them. But with that said, I know it sounds a little weird, but I've actually seen a lot of people who were hope to die drug addicts who ended up in jail and didn't have enough money to pay for their drug, either meth or heroin, and ended up like spending a year or a year and a half sober in jail, and then left jail later. These people tended to have better control of their addictions afterwards. I know this is a very weird comment, but it's a little true. Anyway, we'll continue.
Fuck, I've done 4 rehabs and I repeated the same mistake, but for different reasons. There's always like something to learn from relapses and mistakes you do, but at some point you gotta fucking get it, because ultimately relapse.
I wonder if this is true, but Antoine put a lot of his training footage in between on top of the discussion, and it's interesting to see how his body's changing in the different footage. The one we're looking at now, his eyes seem to be, his pupils, I can't tell if this is true or not, but seem to be very constricted, and he seems to have less body mass and be a little bit dehydrated. I wonder if this was along the process when he was relapsing.
Opiates, what kills the people is the relapse, because the body doesn't have any more tolerance. Then you go right away to overdose, and you pretty much need Narcan. Narcan is like a little push in the nose, or a shot that counteracts the effect of the opiates.
Yeah, this is very true. So I've actually been a little bit lucky. I've never known an opiate addict who closely who died, but I've known a lot of heroin and opiate addicts through my process trying to recover who later died, but they weren't that close to me. Oftentimes, I think almost all the time, maybe more than 60% of the time that opiate addicts die, it's while they're trying to either reduce their dose or quit. When they do so, the body's sensitivity to the opiates decreases, and the opiates are better able to slow down the heart rate to potentially kill someone. And that's what Antoine's talking about. So a lot of the times you'll see heroin addicts get sober, and a month later or so they die. And that's when they relapsed, they took their old dose instead of trying to take a lower dose. Now the funny thing, or not the funny thing, but the odd thing is opiate addicts know this. But the temptation of that initial high, because you know your tolerance has gone down, and you know you can get an amazing high if you use a higher dose, that temptation is honestly often too strong for them to overcome, and that's often how they die.
People don't understand is like this shit like kills a lot of people.
Yeah.
You know, especially opiates. Like you know, other drugs like alcohol, like it will kill you slowly, like or you take an accident. And other drugs like stims that will just drag you on forever, and then your whole life becomes shit, but like for a long time.
Antoine is right. Addiction is no joke. Whether you believe addiction is a disease or something we do to ourselves, it's certainly deadly. One caveat I'd mention is that while opiate addicts often die after relapsing, after they've been sober for a while, alcoholics and benzo addicts, which means Xanax, Valium, are the only people, or GABAergic drug addicts in general, but this is most pronouncedly seen among alcoholics. They can actually die from the withdrawal of the drug itself. The interesting thing is that there is very little evidence that heroin addicts can die from their withdrawals. Even though they hate the withdrawals so much and fear them so much, the withdrawals usually can't actually kill them. Alcoholics, on the other hand, can die from the actual withdrawal, which is called delirium tremens. I almost died several times while I was trying to withdraw from alcohol alone back home. And also, I'd like to mention that while stimulant addiction in general tends not to kill people until their 40s or 50s from heart attacks, there are some things that can go wrong there too. Of course, I'm sure Antoine is protected from this, being such a gentle and wonderful person himself, but you'd be surprised. Some non-violent people can also become violent and have crazy experiences when on stimulants. I think it's because of a combination of the extremely high sympathetic nervous system being driven and the lack of sleep that can cause some kind of paranoia. So to give a personal experience from my own life, one of my best friends from high school and when I was younger, his name was Annous. Annous started using amphetamines, I guess, in his mid-20s or so in Dubai. I didn't know about it at the time. Him and my other close friend, these two were in a group with me when we were in high school. Annous is a nickname for the word Anas in Arabic, God rest his soul. So Annous and the other guy apparently were both using amphetamines. I don't know if they were smoking it or whatever, but it had a huge impact on them. One night, we still don't know between my friends group what happened exactly. But about 3 or 4 years ago, one night, Annous and the other guy were in a house by themselves alone. And they were, I guess, doing some kind of amphetamines. At some point, the other guy got angry at Annous, or they had some kind of argument. The other guy slit Annous's throat and killed him. So one of my friends killed my other friend. And so the guy who killed him is now in jail in the United Arab Emirates, and my other friend is dead. And then the interesting thing is, this is not the first time I've met a meth addict who slit someone's throat. I've actually met another meth addict in LA who was one of the most, he was actually introverted, weak personality. He slit his girlfriend's throat while high on meth. And regretted it tremendously, was not really aware of what he was doing. Of course, these are very extreme examples, but my point is, even alcoholism or stimulant addiction can end your life or really change your life very suddenly, quite early as well.
Addiction doesn't discriminate, and all can kill you, and all different substances can make you suffer and make your life miserable and unmanageable. And sometimes the drugs are behaviors, like sexual, like food, and could be anything, right?
Actually, this is a really interesting point. So, it's a good opportunity to talk about it. Drugs are more addictive generally drugs are addictive because they cause a transmission of dopamine. One cell in your brain releases dopamine to the other cell. That's the very addictive part. Now, most drugs do this indirectly. Amphetamines do this directly, But for example, heroin does this through the opioid receptor indirectly. If the first cell releases dopamine to the other cell while you're doing a certain action, that whole process becomes more addictive. So for example, if you take, let's use as an example, amphetamine. If you take an amphetamine pill in the morning, you just swallow it, and then you get dopamine transmission, and you go do something for the rest of your day, you'll get habituated to what you're doing. But say you were snorting that amphetamine pill, you would get dopamine transmission quicker, and it would be associated with the practice of snorting. This is one of the reasons that cocaine is so addictive. It has a short half-life, and it has a practice that people do with it. And this is also a reason that you see smokers, cigarette smokers, who are supposedly addicted to nicotine, but not the actual practice of smoking. When they go blind, most of them stop smoking, just because they can't see the habit, that's the smoke in the air and the habit that they're doing. So any drug that has a process that's connected with it, so for example, stimulant addicts often have a sexual practice that's connected to it. Not just amphetamine addicts, but also cocaine addicts. So there'll sometimes be a habit that comes along with the drug, and that habit combined with the dopamine transmission is way more difficult to overcome than just the dopamine transmission itself. Another note, this is also why it is always more troubling to redose a dopamine transmitting drug more than once a day. Because if you do it more than once, that your brain starts to connect the action to the dopamine transmission more.
So I came here for 5th rehab, 30 days, because the thing is I didn't lose. Like usually I would go to rehab and I would reach like a super low rock bottom. Like I would lose everything. Like my last rehab, I was like homeless, was beat up, like emotionally, spiritually, and even physically. Like, I don't know if you see the scar there. See the scar? No, it's here. No, it's here.
That's a very interesting comment Antoine makes, is how low is your low before you seek help or in alcoholism or addiction. Most of the people that I met in my recovery process were people who had, like Antoine described in his the first time he sought treatment, had lost everything. People who had lost all their money, their jobs, their friends, all those kind of things. For me, it was very difficult because I was really a serious alcoholic, to the point where probably I would have died before I reached 35 just from the alcohol because of the amount I was drinking. But I hadn't lost a lot of these things in life. I had my job, I had money, I had ability to do things. And so sometimes it's much more difficult to question your whole thinking process and everything about you when your life is going right in some ways. So you can't discount your whole thinking. Because that's one of the hardest things about alcoholism is that, and they'll tell you this, for example, where Antoine goes at AA meetings, they'll tell you, your thinking got you here. So you have to double think everything that you're thinking about because you don't know what part of your thinking is diseased. But it's harder to do that when your life is going a little bit right. You know that you've got some things under control. So you might start to think that your other thinking is also under control.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and about Antoine getting hit that last time. That's another interesting thing about alcoholism. It's interesting how people will pick on people who are weak and in difficult situations. For example, the only time I've ever lost a fight since high school, I think, was when I was an alcoholic in my early 20s. And one night I was a complete alcoholic. I mean, I didn't even know what was going on. And I went to somebody's house party. And I think I got an argument with somebody and they jumped me from behind me. And I was alcoholic, I was drunk, so I couldn't, move my arms properly, so I got jumped. It wasn't too bad, though. It was not nearly as bad as me getting jumped when I was younger. But it's interesting how you'll get hurt when you're an alcoholic or addict. You'll get in weird situations, people will take advantage of you. And not only that, but you'll lose body parts. Like Antoine now, he mentions in this video, he believes that his dehydration may have played a role in him tearing his bicep again. It's funny, I broke the same toe twice because of alcoholism. You lose body parts and you still keep doing it.
I was always saying, I'll go to rehab in 2 days. I said that the whole 3 months I was like going to rehab in the next few days. I would try, so I escaped the rehab. Like there's one of them, I'll do a quick story. I go into the rehab. And they're like, man, you're too messed up. We can't have you.
Really?
Yeah, they said that. So you got to go to the hospital and have some type of detox for a few days and then come back.
That's really interesting. I wonder what they meant when they were telling Antoine he was too messed up. So I wonder if it was because he mentions he has a stimulant addiction. So I wonder if his heart rate was too high and his blood pressure was too high. By the way, sometimes when stimulant addicts will stay awake for a couple of days and use stimulants, their blood pressure will really get very high and heart rate will get really, really high and they won't even realize it. So I wonder if that's what they saw there, or if it was the fact that he hadn't slept, or maybe it was a combination. Because the other interesting thing is this: when your drug of choice is a stimulant, just to get by in life, sometimes you have to use a tranquilizer like a Xanax or something like that to look normal. Because you hadn't slept, you're hyped up, wired, you might be shaking a little bit, so to calm yourself down. So there could be polypharmacy going on. And it's interesting that a rehab would have told him this. I mean, the whole purpose of a rehab compared to a sober living is that they have the treatment facility to deal with you medically.
They sent me to the hospital, and then they take my arm and they put 12 vials that they have to fill up with my blood on the table. I'm like, whoa, like, give me a second there, like. And then just before that, they were like, we gotta take your temperature. So they take this little thing, it's like, we'll put that in your rectum. I'm like, I said, do you want me to do it or the girl? I said, I want the girl. And then the guy just was, I don't know, I'll do it. Like the guy was what to do. I'll put that in my butt myself. Put it in my butt. It was a freaking nightmare. And then I'll see all the vials and my arms were all busted already. Anyways, I was like, you know what? Just give me a second. I'm having a fucking stressing out here. So he leaves. And then 20 seconds passes. Fucking ripped everything off my chest. The thing goes flatline because then I pick up my clothes, everything, pick up my stuff, and I run. I was running to the hospital. And the girl said, "Wait, your health card." Grab the health card, run, and I jump in a random bus that was there. And then I was like, I found somebody that drove an hour and a half, picked me up. Then I kept partying for like,
oh my God,
whatever.
Yeah.
First thing is I have to applaud Antoine at his incredible honesty. I mean, you can imagine how difficult it is, to be honest, to describe your mistakes that you don't even understand why you did them to the public. But beyond that, it's also interesting to note that when an alcoholic or addict is suffering and they're about to go to recovery, they still feel the need to go do that drug a little bit more. Now, some people who aren't addicts or alcoholics may think, oh, this person's so selfish. They want so much pleasure. It might not be that. It may be that the person's level of, say, subjective well-being or happiness naturally is so low that the difference between that and them using the drug is of such a magnitude that when they know they've got to be sober for the rest of their life, in their minds that involves misery and despair, and they say, oh, I can get some relief, a little bit more relief before I have to buckle down and suffer for the rest of my life. So it's really not, I really believe that most addicts, it's not a greed, but rather the relief that they experience that causes them to want a little bit more before I stop.
This time around, I didn't lose everything. The main thing I lost, to be honest, is trust from all my friends and Sam and people around me, right? So that sucks. And I lost respect.
Actually, on this comment, it's also interesting. Antoine mentions that the biggest thing he lost here was the belief and trust of his friends and close associates. The reason he lost that was because he was so honest initially with his sobriety. So for example, when I became sober in my mid-20s, I didn't tell anyone. Nobody back, none of my friends knew what I was up to. I was independently trying to be sober, failing, succeeding, not telling anyone back home or any of my friends from my previous life. I actually moved when I was trying to get sober. So I didn't tell anyone because just telling people was humiliating. And then what if I told them and failed? The humiliation is even worse. But Antoine truly invested in his sobriety and is doing it again. And experiencing that humiliation of letting people down that you care about, that you love, and that you really appreciate what they did for you. And feeling like, you're a despicable person, or I can't imagine what else he feels. It's extremely brave.
That's why my content for the whole month of June was like kind of like the minimum. I did my best, and I think it was all right. But, it's not my usual like stories every day that I'm doing. It's like people like, oh, maybe it's his bicep they're thinking, but no, it's a lot more than that. The bicep is like, that's like,
nothing.
This is a small. This is a small problem. That is my bicep tear problem, and this is like my other problem, right? So I was. That's okay. Rich Older. I found the rehab. I'm gonna go. They're gonna allow me to do a little bit of work every day.
Exactly. So this is what I was talking about earlier. You go to you really want to invest in your sobriety. You give up everything. You're ready to go, and then you have Well, actually, you know what they call this in AA? They call this reservations. Oh, wait, I have to post these things. I gotta do this. I gotta have my phone because I have to respond to people. I gotta do something. And you put all those. It's an interesting thing. I still don't know exactly why this happens, but it happens to almost everybody that wants to go to sober living.
I had to choose between my friends who love me, who care for me, who want to help me, or the drugs.
Right.
Like, I could have left, but that would have been literally a fucking suicide, pretty much. Like a friendship suicide, social suicide, spiritual suicide. Would be like pretty much like I would like just choose the wrong thing.
When an addict or alcoholic has it in mind that they're going to use their drug of choice one more time, or even use it in general, and they get stopped, like someone stops you from doing it against your will because you either care about their feelings or whatever, it's extremely aggravating, the feeling. Extremely aggravating. In fact, it can feel like not only aggravating but frightening, losing control of your situation. And by the way, let's talk about why. One interesting thing about addiction is the fact that, dopamine in life guides our behavior. Normally, we get dopamine transmission when we do something, some behavior in life, that is naturally rewarding to us. For people like myself and maybe Antoine, we may have had lower dopamine transmission naturally, maybe due to something in our childhood or something else. And so when you start using a drug, you cause dopamine transmission. You take control of your happiness. Normally, exterior things in your life would make you transmit dopamine. Now, you're controlling the transmission of dopamine. So it gives you a sort of control and confidence, even though it leads you, because humans should not control their own dopamine in that sense, it leads you eventually to misery, but along the way you feel like you can control your life. If you lose your job, you can go home and do your drug. If your partner breaks up with you, you could do your drug also. You can do your drug to take control of your happiness acutely at any one moment. But every time you do it, it worsens your happiness long term.
I was angry, but not because I couldn't do it. I was angry because I realized, like, holy shit, I'm that much like addicted to it.
Yeah.
I thought like with time I would be better, and I thought like I'll do the rest and come back. Would be like that. Would be like me controlling it, but stopping not on my terms was like maybe have a mental breakdown. Like for 40 minutes, I was like in that chair crying, like realizing like how powerless I was.
And also, I bet it was also the fact that Antoine was really realizing, seeing his irrationality. I'm trying to be sober, but some reason my brain is telling me, hey, if you titrate down, why don't you not quit automatically? It's too difficult on you. Titrate down a little bit, it'll be easier. Or even goes further, if you try to titrate down, it says, oh, you're controlling this pretty well. You can control this. It's a very insidious thing.
I made one bad decision. I did the rest of the month and a half was like me trying to stop and then me changing my mind the whole time. So I would throw it in the toilet. I would sleep. The next day I would wake up, last a little bit, and then be like, just get some more.
Yeah.
So it is insanity. Yeah.
That is the definition of insanity or craziness, really, if you think about it. What is being crazy? Being crazy is being irrational. And what is being irrational? I actually used to study rationality in grad school. I wanted to originally do a PhD on the subject of rationality. Rationality means consistency, just internal consistency. And if you want to use drugs and then don't want to use drugs later, but then want to use drugs again, but then want to quit it, you're faced with your own irrationality. Is that you're not rational over time. You don't have time-consistent rationality. So this is one of the fascinating things about addiction, is that sometimes you face your insanity and you see it. I want this. Once I do this, I want something else. I'm not consistent. I want to quit, but when I quit, I don't want to quit. And it can be really terrifying, actually, to face these things.
So are you saying because you were addicted to like the prep and the like prepping that is a warning sign for the addiction? Let
me like clarify that.
Okay.
I wasn't addicted to it, but because I stopped, right? I stopped the show.
Right.
So what happened is that I was obsessing over it. So during this whole time, I was like, I don't feel like using drugs at all. Like it's been
right.
Like,
that's what I would. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, I don't feel like using drugs at all, because the void that I feel inside, that's been there since I'm a kid, was being filled with something else.
Right.
right? So not by something I was addicted, something I was obsessing over, because I'm not addicted to bodybuilding shows. They're really hard.
So this is a really interesting subject, and I'm going to use this opportunity to describe some of my thoughts about how addiction happens. One of them is this. Not all addicts are like this, but I noticed a common phenotype among people that are addicted to drugs and alcohol. Not everybody's like this, but I certainly was. There are some people that I believe have naturally low dopamine transmission for the events of their life, what they do, their habits, and so on. So these people, when they find something that causes dopamine transmission, tend to do it very well, obsessively. They tend to overachieve. These people also tend to have personalities that are what are called cyclothemic, which is they go through periods of more energy and periods of less energy. I believe these people are natural overachievers, but when they meet drugs or alcohol, it's their kryptonite. Because what happens is, remember, as we were saying before, normally your life's real experiences give you dopamine transmission. But when you take a drug, you just took control of your own dopamine transmission. For people like this that are so sensitive to dopamine transmission, it can be the end of their productivity entirely.
We can easily obsess about anything. People can obsess about work or things that are really hard or a certain period of time. So I don't think it's, in my head, it's not really an addiction, but it was more of an obsession for a time being, that there was an end date. But that's a problem.
That is a clear problem. So obviously this is way more complicated than what Antoine's just discussing right now, but you can't have goals that are just short term. You have to have, in this mind state, this is maybe specific to addicts, but also it applies generally. I don't think human beings can be very happy if they live entirely in the future, entirely for a goal, sacrificing always today for the future. They also, I don't believe, can be entirely happy. In fact, they'll be miserable if they live only for the present and don't have anything to look forward to. We get restless if we're not moving in a certain direction. So the key is to have an overarching goal for the lifetime that then has mini goals, and then to live in the process getting toward those goals. To do so, you have to like both your goal and the process. So for example, you might like money, but you might not like accounting. So even though you might like the salary as being an accountant, you might not like the job. And therefore, if you become an accountant, you're always going to live in the future because you're not going to enjoy the process that you're doing. So it's very key that you have goals over time and that you enjoy the process, but then also that you live in the moment somehow, which is, of course, very difficult to do.
I was filling up the void with the obsession of bodybuilding and contest prep, which was great for the shows, bad for relationships, bad for this and that, bad for a lot of other things, including my recovery, of course. So the show's over, Olympia's done, and I was already doing like a little bit of Xanax to go to bed.
Let's comment on that as well. So Xanax is a short-acting benzodiazepine that's a GABA-A receptor modulator. Xanax is a bit safer than the longer-acting versions like Valium and Klonopin, but generally these drugs are known for horrific withdrawals. They're one of the few drugs on earth that can kill you just because of their withdrawal. They also produce rapid tachyphylaxis, which means if you take the drug for about 2 months straight, I know Antoine wasn't talking about that, but say you take the Xanax every night for 2 months straight, 2 months in, you'll start to have a paucity, it means little inhibitory signaling during the day, because your body's used to the Xanax coming in at night. So in the day, you'll be a bit more tense, and then at night, while it may regulate your circadian rhythm, you'll start to feel less and less effects from the Xanax. What's worse is that GABA-A receptor modulators cause some dopamine transmission consequently. So somebody like myself or Antoine who have a history with addiction, we would prefer not to use benzos. Not only that, by the way, but benzos have been shown to worsen mortality when taken as a sleep aid. What I prefer to do is take something called Seroquel or quetiapine. Seroquel is an antipsychotic, but don't let that scare you too much. You can use it under a doctor's supervision at below the therapeutic dose as a sleep aid. What Seroquel does is it's sort of like taking a Benadryl before bed. Benadryl blocks histamine. Histamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, but so is dopamine, so is glutamate, and Seroquel blocks all three of those. So Seroquel, instead of upregulating GABA, which is way more dangerous, it just blocks the excitatory signaling. And it'll leave you a little bit drowsy in the morning, even at 50 milligrams or 100 milligrams. But I think it's one of the best ways to go to sleep pre-contest instead of using actual sedatives. This just works by blocking excitatory things, not sedating you directly.
That's another warning sign, like abusing prescription meds.
Actually, on this topic, I think Antoine doesn't mention this in this video, but he mentioned it in an earlier video. It's really interesting to think that Antoine's drug of choice was stimulants, but he also has ADHD. And this is really troubling because then your medicine for your condition somewhat is related to your drug of choice in the sense that, at least for example, we know this. If you give somebody even 10 milligrams of Adderall daily, from rodent studies, you can see that they become more likely to do other dopaminergic things because the Adderall increases their dopaminergic activity. One of the ways that you can reduce addiction long-term, for example, is giving someone something like Seroquel that blocks dopamine receptors. So if you take Seroquel every night, during the day, you'll be less likely to be interested in addictive things. So when you take Adderall, the opposite may happen. And this is really a big concern. Myself, personally, I never abused Adderall or prescription amphetamines because of my fear. I knew that I had ADHD and I needed to use them to study when I was younger. And I was afraid that I would worsen my ability to use them if I ever needed them. This is also what protected me, honestly, from opiates as well.
My fear is fear of abandonment from a trauma when I was a kid, which is not like a big deal. But for me, it was. When my parents divorced, my dad wasn't there because he's an alcoholic. You know, I forgave him for all that because when you're a 20-year-old alcoholic having a kid, it's not easy. So I love my dad. I forgive him.
Wow, that's really interesting. Antoine and I have a lot in common. My parents also divorced when I was very young. My mother abandoned me when I was a child, and my father didn't fully abandon, but he moved out. He didn't live with me from when I was 11 or 10 years old. And my father was also an alcoholic. But I also, like Antoine, forgive my father completely. And I'm very grateful to my father for what he did for me. And this is one of the important elements of sobriety also. Getting rid of resentments that you may have toward others or toward yourself. This is something commonly done in AA. And I think Antoine has probably worked on those resentments himself and gone through them, which is really important. But nonetheless, Antoine is talking about how what happened in his childhood makes him the addict he is today. And in AA, sometimes they'll talk about this like in terms of psychotherapy, as if almost your conscious memory is causing you to use drugs now. Like consciously, I was treated badly as a kid, so I'm using. But I like to think of it instead that something happened in childhood that physically changed your brain. Because, for example, there's evidence that children who have traumatic childhoods have smaller hippocampuses. That's the memory center of the brain. They also have disconnected amygdalas from the rest of the brain. That's the fight or flight center of the brain. They also often have GABAergic deficits, which means too little inhibitory hormones in the brain, which feels sort of like the opposite of taking a Xanax, right? So there are physical effects on the brain that happen from the trauma in childhood. I'm sure also your recollection of the events, like for example, for me, I know I've always thought of myself as being a little incapable or stupid or so on because when I was a kid, my father used to, instead of using my name, would just call me idiot. So I got used to hating myself, feeling incompetent, incapable and so on. But that memory is harmful in some way. But the physical effect it had on my brain of making me anxious and so on is the really profound effect that I think gets influenced when I drink. When I drink, I normally have a GABAergic deficit. When I drink, I don't have that deficit anymore. I become comfortable in my own skin, you know? So I think it's more of a chemistry issue rather than a conscious issue. We are not as conscious as we think we are, really.
It's still what happened still hurt me. So since then, I feel worthless, and I'm always unsafe, and I'm afraid that to be left alone, to be abandoned.
So, for example, how could Antoine feel unsafe? Through remembering the events of his childhood, but also simply through having too little GABAergic signaling while he's an adult. Just having too little GABAergic signaling will sort of feel like you took clenbuterol or a little bit of Trenbolone or something like that. GABA is what inhibits the sympathetic nervous system. And when GABA is lessened, you're more hyped up, more on edge, less relaxed, more fearful, just by definition. And so we know you can get GABAergic deficits from trauma in childhood. So all of this can be chemical, really.
Pretty much I have like abandonment phobia. You know, like people with arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, it's a little dust would fall on their shoulders. Ah, spider!
Yeah.
But there was spider there. So I would be seeing abandonment where it's not even there.
I think what Antoine's talking about is the paranoia that can develop from having high dopaminergic, high adrenaline signaling for extended period, but from stimulants specifically. You can start to become paranoid, especially from not sleeping. You can start to doubt people. In fact, you can start to see things. A lot of people who use stimulants like Coke and stuff like that have crazy stories of when they were up all night doing Coke one night and they thought there were ninjas outside or thought there were snipers outside or whatever. They'll look out the window, so you can get very paranoid. And of course, if you have a fear of abandonment, that could influence you from the drug itself. But even non-stimulant drugs like alcohol made me doubt myself more and doubt others care for me more and so on. So I'm not sure exactly how that happens. I understand stimulants would do it by upregulating dopamine and adrenaline, but maybe it works through dopamine as well with other drugs. Who knows? But it's an interesting thing when you start to become not just paranoid, but start to doubt yourself even more and doubt others more when you're not actually paranoid.
So I was pretty much relying like, oh, I can't party because I got to train in the morning with Big Mike.
Yeah.
So that was the only thing that was holding me back pretty much almost at some point. And then when I got my ankle surgery, couldn't train for a few days, I fucking slipped.
So now Antoine goes through a process of explaining how he didn't have that many things in his life that guarded him against his relapse. So he was saying, I had mainly the gym and mainly a specific trainer I was going to see. And things would put me in a situation where I couldn't go to the gym. So I didn't have that much to lose if I relapsed. There's a couple of ways to look at it though. So you can either build up your life further, or you can reduce the gain that comes from relapsing. So, for example, if you're not doing anything pharmacologically that's sustainable, unlike hedonistic drug use, to improve your psychology, even if your life is going very well and you pray and you have community and so on, your subjective well-being will be lower than if it was pharmacologically affected. So the gap between your subjective well-being, your happiness level currently, between when you're sober and if you go use some amphetamine, is way larger than if you were using some drugs that made you feel a little bit better naturally, but were sustainable. So this is one of the approaches that I've taken personally. I found that if I could make myself happier when I'm sober, there's far less of an attractive need to go use a hedonistic drug. And that's been more preservative for me than building my life up. Because even if I build my life up and I don't want to lose certain things, suffering is difficult to tolerate when you don't have a reason to suffer. By the way, one tip though, if you are suffering, find a reason to suffer, and you can suffer through anything.
And my recovery was only relying on my training, of the fact that I was accountable to the gym, to Big Mike, which, by the way, is furious. He's furious, and I understand. I wasted his time and I was disrespectful. This is what drugs gotta do. Like, I just become a fucking failure, like a nuisance. Like when I'm in recovery and I do videos like that, I share stuff, I'm an inspiration. When I use drugs, a nuisance.
Wow, that was powerful. That's exactly what I was talking about before. What I was really trying to say is that some addicts are actually extremely high-performing people that met their kryptonite. And if they didn't meet that kryptonite, they would be the CEOs, the world leaders, the presidents, and so on. And I think that Antoine is one of those people. With drugs, he says he's he confused me about nuisance. He's a nuisance. And when he's not using drugs, he's an inspiration to other people. He's an Ubermensch. But when he is using drugs, he loses everything.
During the move, at some point, I just tore my bicep.
Crazy.
So it's like people think, like people might think, oh, the bicep tear is why you relapsed. No, the bicep tear probably happened because of their relapse.
Wow, Antoine, I can't commend this gentleman enough. He had the opportunity to let, for the sake of his career, his ego, even his subjective well-being, to let people believe that the poor guy ripped his bicep twice and that's why he relapsed. Everybody would understand. People would think, well, he probably got on painkillers because of the surgery, and he went through 2 surgeries. Now it's the second one. This time he used the painkillers, and it got him to relapse. Nobody would even judge him. But to be honest, because he takes his sobriety so seriously, he outed himself. He told you, no, I ripped my bicep because of the relapse. And just to explain a little bit about that, by the way, sometimes when people are using stimulants, I'm not saying this is what happens to Antoine, but in general, they tend to stay awake more than one night in a row. So for example, once I stayed awake 5 days in a row. Sometimes you hear them 7 days, something like that. They stay awake. They tend not to drink much or eat much. So they dehydrate. And then the third thing is that you can become obsessed with certain things while using stimulants on end. So in particular, for example, meth addicts in LA are notorious for their love of cleaning. The cleaning is generally something that they get obsessed with, doing physical work, getting things done. But you can also get obsessed, like Antoine said, with your phone, with a computer, get stuck there for 3 hours. And it seems what happened to Antoine is that he got obsessed with lifting this fridge while he was extremely dehydrated. You can't commend this man enough for his honesty.
But the thing is, the surgeon said I had diseased tendons, so it was bound to happen.
Wow.
But really, am I going to tell my... No, it's like, if I would have said properly, ate properly, and fucking not be like, I can do this myself, like obsessed, like on drugs, like.
Yeah, that's what he's talking about, that obsession and overconfidence. You can also get overconfidence when on stimulants because of the dopamine transmission. But I wanted to make another note also. Note that even if he was building up his life to avoid losing things for the addiction, building up your life with the gym has an actual impact on your psychology too. It's sort of like taking pharmacology or medicines. Because every time you go to the gym, you have cholinergic transmission, opioidergic transmission, GABAergic transmission. Your brain changes. You get increases of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Your brain changes. If you stop going to the gym, you've just actually, it's almost like taking medicines out. So it's not just the fact that I'll lose my career, but I'm not going to the gym right now, so I've actually removed some of my actual medicine for my brain. So I didn't even think about that initially.
People already know me as like, why does he look like he skipped like 1,000 meals? Like, why does he look like he lost 15 pounds in like 3 days?
That's one of the most unpleasant experiences of being an addict or alcoholic, is when you go on a bender or a run, like with stimulant addicts, they go on what they call a run, 7 days or 5 days they're awake. When somebody you know, and even sometimes a stranger, meets you and sees you up close, like for a stimulant addict, they'll notice that he's a little shaky, anxious, moving quickly, maybe his movements are a bit jerky, his pupils are constricted. They'll see this in you and there'll be a look of fear or disgust, like what's happening to this person? And you'll register that also. And you'll be like, God damn, how I'm living is so shocking that the person who doesn't know me or knows me is just bewildered just by looking at me. It's a really powerful feeling. You'll never forget that when it happens to you.
The guy who puts you to sleep, anesthesiologist, that you took fucking all these drugs. And I'm like, fuck, I don't want to postpone this. I've already waited 3 weeks more, like a week more than usual. Usually I did a surgery after 14 days. Must be 3 weeks. So I called the hospital. I said, can I do it awake? He said, yeah, it's not required, but.
So apparently Antoine did the surgery awake because he was afraid of being put under, which is really brave. I wonder if he experienced a lot of pain during the surgery. He said he didn't use stimulants the day before. I once got a tattoo on stimulants. It was by far, I don't feel pain that easily. I'm quite resistant to it. But this one tattoo, I had a body tremor, almost seizures by the end because of the stimulants. They increase, they have like a nociceptive effect. They increase your sensation of pain. So hopefully it didn't end up with a very painful surgery.
You can do it awake. We'll just put a lot of sedatives in you. I'm like, okay, so a lot of sedatives sounds better than being put under.
That's true though. It's not just the fact that you might not wake up, but every time you get put under, there's significant brain damage that occurs. So if you don't get put under entirely, you'll preserve your brain function much better. Also, one thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention so far, we have to mention that because of, I'm saying this mainly for Antoine's sake, because of the fact that he likes stimulants specifically, and he's a bodybuilder that's a heavyweight, there's a multiplicative effect on cardiomegaly, the growth of his heart. I would imagine that he should really keep close tabs with fMRI scans on his heart function, on his left ventricle, seeing if the wall is thickened, if it's enlarged, and whether he has any plaque. Because the biggest concern for a stimulant user in early life would be if his heart just stopped beating, either due to some kind of failure in the heart muscle itself or due to the plaque and the vasoconstriction from the stimulant and so on. So it's something to note. He should really be careful about that.
Like I feel better now than I felt the whole year.
Good.
I told you before that too. Like I feel better now than I've been like in, I don't remember when.
Wow.
So I was like, why was I not doing all that? So let's see about why all this happened. The relapse that started before I picked up the drug, right? Because like my addiction started at that moment as a kid that I was traumatized and the fear was created and the feeling of being unworthy and feeling not good enough and the fear of being abandoned. My addiction started there.
I don't believe that this is true. I think that the addiction started when you encountered the drug. I believe that and I just say this because I used to live in a region of the world where there are certain societies that are entirely teetotalers. They don't drink, they don't use drugs. It's not commonly done in the Middle East in some societies. And even in those societies, you'll encounter people that have the that have those traumatic experiences in childhood and all that kind of stuff, but never end up near the situations that that people who've actually used drugs end up. And that's the reason why in the early 20th century there was a great movement to ban the sale of alcohol in the United States. Because when people don't use alcohol, it's very rare that they beat their wives and they do certain things like that. So there are some elements that come from the drug itself. But also talking about his experiences in childhood, did those experiences, the low self-esteem, make him addicted to drugs? I feel that the low self-esteem or the experiences in childhood made his brain uncomfortable to himself, such that using drugs was such an improvement in his disposition and his happiness level. And that's what led someone to use drugs. So it's still the same thing, the childhood experiences. But the difference here is important because in psychotherapy, they'll try to convince you that your experiences, if you could drill enough into your experiences, you can heal yourself. What I'm trying to say is those experiences change the physical structure of your brain. And the only way to heal yourself is to change the structure of your brain again. And you could do that with changes in your life, like prayer, community, and so on, but not as massively as you can with medicines.
I picked up a drink at 17 or 18 years old. You know, it started back then.
You know what's funny with picking up a drink at 17, 18 years old? Personally, I had only intoxicated a few times in around the age of 15, and then never again until I was around 21. And I remember being at actually it was a pub in Amsterdam with a few of my friends, and them trying to convince me to drink. I had been just a guy who never drinks. I'd go out with them, they'd be drinking, I was always sober. So they were trying to convince me to drink, and I was in grad school, and I thought about it, but then I told them, I'm afraid that if I do, I'll become an alcoholic. And the reason why I said so is because I saw my father and my family history and so on. And I didn't know how right I was. And they convinced me that I wouldn't and so on. And I drank. A couple of years later, I was an alcoholic. So it's shocking. I wonder if Antoine also had the same fears when he was younger because of his father.
I was like, oh shit, I like that. And I didn't like drinking. It's more when I started doing raves at 20, I was like, whoa, this makes a lot of sense. I like that.
Yeah, and this is a common experience with addicts. Like, not every drug affects people the same way. So, for example, for me, I tried opiates many times. Not trying to use them long term. I knew you couldn't get away with it. So maybe that's what saved me a little bit. But the pleasure I got from using an opiate, way less than most of my friends. And the pleasure I got from even using stimulants also probably less than most of my friends. But alcohol made me feel just right, So a lot of addicts will find a certain drug, because of the neurotransmitters that it affects, will make them feel the right way. And that really is an indication of what's wrong in their brain, to be honest with you.
I registered that. So I was feeling like shit, pretty much. I found something that I liked. My brain remembered. And then the wire was made. The wires were like connected. And then it's like Pavlov's bell. You ring the bell, the dog salivates.
Yeah, every time you do that. So this is what happens, right? You've just discovered that this thing, if you use this thing, you can make your life just right. No matter what's gone wrong. Your girlfriend broke up with you, you lost your job, whatever. Use this drug, everything's right. Now, say you do lose your job. You go through trauma. Your brain says, oh, I could go drink or I could go use this drug. And you do it. Now you've just connected trauma to that drug. And every time you get sad or in a difficult situation, you think of that drug again. To undo these cognitive connections, you can't undo any connections in your brain. You can just strengthen others. So you have to do converse action. You get sad, you specifically go do the opposite of what you were going to do before. And you do that as many times as you used to use the drug. It still won't be as effective because the drug offers a huge reward. But you can slowly weaken those connections by strengthening others.
COVID happened, and then the meetings were Zoom. There were no meetings. So I was like, I feel good. I don't feel like using drugs at all. I'm tripping. I'm good. I don't want to do Zoom meetings.
So what are meetings? In Alcoholics Anonymous, which borrows, as I said, most of its principles from religion, they have sort of a thing that's sort of like going to church. They have little office spaces or whatever that the organization rents, and people go to these meetings. There are different kinds of meetings. There are meetings for one gender. There are meetings that have a certain speaker. There are meetings in which people share. But basically, it's like going to church for alcoholics. They go there to feel a sense of community, to hear the message again of sobriety, and to help others also. A part of Alcoholics Anonymous is a service, helping others. This is one of the most important principles to leading a happy life, by the way.
And I tried Zoom meetings, and no, I don't like it. Stupid. So I'll just do a step work with my sponsor should be good.
So what's step work with a sponsor? Remember, AA is a program, they call it a 12-step program. I don't remember what the steps are exactly, but there are certain steps that are also based off religion to get an addict into a state of honesty, service, responsibility, and so on. The addict will go through the steps with another addict who has longer sobriety time than himself, and that other addict is called a sponsor. And you sort of use a sponsor to go through the steps, and also, even more importantly, as a person to check your thinking. Remember, the troubling thing about addiction is that you know that your thinking got you there. So you know that you have trouble thinking. So you often need somebody to double check what you're thinking, to see if it sounds rational to you. So that's the role of a sponsor, really. By the way, as a side note, I just realized I never succeeded in getting a sponsor. I had extreme difficulty listening to somebody else. Really extreme difficulty. I couldn't do it. Even when I was really trying to recover from alcoholism and so on, trying my best by myself, I got offered to people want to sponsor me, and that's the crazy thing. When some parts of your life are going right, you think that you're more intelligent than the other person, and you don't want to listen to them. So especially for me, it was really difficult to listen to a man. So I tried to get a female sponsor, but in AAs, apparently they frown on this. So I ended up with I never got a sponsor from the thing. I applaud Antoine that he's able to have a sponsor.
In this rehab, I'm learning a lot about my thinking errors. Now I catch myself, like, for example, sometimes I'm really black and white thinking. Because it's either that or that, all or nothing.
This is brilliant. It seems that Antoine is doing cognitive behavioral therapy. It's probably the most scientifically justified form of psychotherapy. I don't know if you can call it psychotherapy, but therapy.
Yeah.
It's good for sometimes when you train for a show, it's like, let's go all or nothing. But with other things in life, it's not good at all. It makes you do like a lot of mistakes.
Note, Antoine, though, that all or nothing mentality is the mentality that the most high-powered, high-performing individuals in the world have. They're not moderate. You don't become a billionaire by being moderate. You don't. So there are people that have that all or nothing mentality, but they just don't have drugs. And it may limit them in their life, but it can also be extremely empowering. So I like to talk about this because a lot of addicts seem to look at themselves like they're just weak or they just have something wrong with them. And it may not be something wrong. It could be a superpower that could go very wrong if you meet drugs. But if you don't, that all or nothing mentality could deliver you more out of your life than other people get by being moderate and being even keel.
I would think the example with my friends, like not liking me and be like, you got to quarantine. I would take it so personal because like my friends don't love me. They don't care about me. I really felt like that. Like I'm like I was hurt like when I was abandoned like, as a kid by my dad and not getting enough love and stuff. I felt like that. I was like so hurt. I was like, they don't give a shit about me. Like, fuck, why? And I was so angry and sad at the same time.
Two comments. The first is addicts are often hypersensitive emotionally. And I believe that this often has a connection to childhood traumas. And so addicts and alcoholics may seem callous or tough by the way they're behaving, but often they're hypersensitive. In fact, actually, this is also common among juvenile delinquents. You often find that criminals in society who are juvenile delinquents often had traumatic childhoods originally and ended up in fights actually because they felt criticized or attacked as children and overreacted. So he may be hypersensitive. The second thing I want to mention is, what is this handle that he's using on the lat pull-down machine? It's really fantastic. It looks like an arm wrestling handle. I really want to use it.
Sometimes my patience is tested. Like one time something happened. Some guy I was sharing, because I like to share, I want to, but sometimes I share too much sometimes because right now I'm talking a lot. Like I could do that in there, but I try to catch myself and not do it, right? So, but some guy just cut me off because he was tired, started reading his thing. I fucking was so upset. I was like, this guy doesn't give a shit about like the recovery, about their group. He doesn't give a shit about any of us. And then I was like going on, right? But pretty much he was like, just like his wife's mom was dying that day. He was like, he lost patience. I was like, why? Because he's a human. So I say I called my sponsor, Aaron. I was like, Aaron, you did that. So how can I feel better about this? He said, well, see it as an opportunity from the divine. God is giving you a gift, a challenge, like Big Mike gives you a set.
This is incredible. So Antoine was just telling a story of how he was in a meeting and somebody wasn't listening to his share, and he started getting upset with the person, only to discover later that that person's mother was dying or something like that. And the only reason I could think that Antoine would have to tell this story to the public is to show his true self and all his weaknesses so that he can face them properly. It reminds me actually of a story, a true story, a historical story of the second caliph of the Islamic Empire. His name was Umar bin Al-Khattab. Umar apparently began to feel that he was becoming ego-driven when he was the caliph. And so in order to put himself back in place, he actually went and gave a speech to his congregation. And in the speech, told a story, a humiliating story of his 20s, something really ridiculous that he did. After the speech, his community came to him and asked him, why would you humiliate yourself in front of us like this with this story unnecessarily? And he said, I noticed that I was becoming, paraphrase, that I was becoming ego-driven, and I decided to put myself back in my place. This is really something similar to what Antoine is doing right now. You see this sometimes in AA meetings, but it's rare to see it outside AA. And Antoine is doing this, I think, for a very good reason and intentionally. It's really inspirational.
I was like, thanks, but fuck you, you know? Because he's right. Like, but in the rehab, you're around these things and you got all the support to deal with it, these factors. So
I don't usually do these kind of commentaries, but I found Antoine's video so valuable, as well as, to be honest with you, so beautiful for its honesty, that I thought I could commentate on it, and maybe it would be helpful for people that have relatives or friends who may be addicted to something, or people who are actually struggling with addiction themselves. As a final note, I'd like to remind you guys about one distinction I made in this discussion, which is this idea that how can you protect yourself from addiction? Well, one of the things you can do is build up your sober life so that you have a lot to lose if you become an addict again. But the other way is by making your current state of happiness higher so that you have less to gain from using the drug. So if your subjective well-being naturally is a bit higher, then the jump to using a drug is lower. So the attractiveness of using the drug, or what we call an AA, going out or relapsing, is lower. I hope that maybe Antoine, if he hasn't already, could try to incorporate some of that in the future, and I hope that it would fare him well. He's certainly a very beloved member of the community, and he should be in all of our prayers. I wish you guys a great day, and I'll see you soon.